She was calm, quiet, just trying to get to her goddaughter's graduation. But somewhere over Tennessee, a flight attendant looked at her scrubs and decided she didn't belong. First, they skipped her. Then, they warned her. Then, they tried to humiliate her in front of everyone. But what they didn't know was who she really was, and who else was quietly watching. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss future stories like this one. The plane hummed gently as it sat on the tarmac, waiting for final boarding. Rhonda Bell folded her coat over her arm and stepped into the aisle, scanning for seat 14A. Her back ached from 3 double shifts in a row at the hospital, but today wasn't about work. She was headed to Atlanta, where her goddaughter, Grace, would walk the graduation stage in a lavender gown Rhonda had helped buy. Her navy blue scrubs were neatly pressed, even though she wasn't on duty. A small silver pin that read, RN Trauma Certified, was clipped to her chest. She wore it quietly, like everything else in her life. She found her seat in the emergency exit row. It had extra legroom and a clear view of the aisle. Rhonda reached up to place her coat in the bin. The overhead compartment stuck slightly, and she gave it a gentle tug. "Ma'am, those bins are reserved for premium ticket holders," said a voice behind her. She turned and saw a blonde flight attendant, her name tag reading Kelly Bowers. Kelly didn't smile. Her tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't kind either, just cold enough to feel unnecessary. Rhonda lowered her coat and spoke softly. "This is my assigned seat, emergency row, 14A. Kelly didn't respond right away. Her eyes moved over Rhonda's badge, then her scrubs, then back to the coat. She stepped aside without another word. Rhonda slid into her seat, folded the coat on her lap, and looked out the window. The woman next to her, a young mother, gave a quick smile but didn't say anything. Rhonda nodded politely. She'd been through this before. Same uniform. Same quiet doubt in someone's eyes. Same fight to stay calm. The cabin filled quickly. Passengers shuffled in, overhead bins clicked shut, and voices murmured about connection times and hotel reservations. Rhonda opened her small notebook, flipped past patient notes, and began reading a page titled, Signs of Internal Bleeding, Emergency Checklist. Not because she needed to study. It was just habit. It kept her hands busy when the silence around her got too heavy. Then Kelly walked by again. She stopped 2 rows ahead, leaned into a white man's seat, and asked with a cheerful tone, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Langston. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Rhonda didn't look up. She didn't need to. The warmth in Kelly's voice had never reached her brow. The plane had taken off smoothly, with only a slight jolt as the wheels left the ground. Rhonda sat upright, hands folded over her coat. The seatbelt light was still on, and Kelly made another pass through the aisle, checking for compliance. As she passed row 14, her eyes flicked toward Rhonda, then away, as if she hadn't seen her at all. She stopped at row 15, leaned toward a man in a suit, and asked if he needed help adjusting his seat. Rhonda noticed how her voice turned lighter, even friendly. A few minutes later, the drink cart rattled down the aisle. Kelly and another attendant handed out menus to the rows ahead. Rhonda watched as each row received small black leather folders with options for snacks and beverages. When the cart reached her, Kelly reached across Rhonda's lap without looking at her and handed a menu to the man in 14C. Then she handed another to the young mother in 14B. Rhonda waited quietly, but no menu came. She glanced down, then slowly looked up. Kelly had already turned to row 15. Rhonda cleared her throat gently, but Kelly didn't turn around. The other flight attendant, a younger man with dark-rimmed glasses, glanced at Rhonda and gave her a small, unsure smile. But he didn't speak. Rhonda leaned back in her seat. She wasn't thirsty, not really. She just wanted the choice, the recognition. It was a small thing, a menu, but it spoke loud enough to sting. She had been given no eye contact, no smile, no offer, just air. She kept her face calm, but her fingers gently pressed against her thighs. Not in anger, just to remind herself she was still here, present. Real. The woman across the aisle in 13C gave Rhonda a strange glance. She had noticed too. Rhonda said nothing. She turned the page in her notebook and underlined the phrase, rapid, shallow breathing. Observe, don't assume. Turbulence began lightly. Just a few shakes at first, enough to cause coffee to ripple in plastic cups. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and practiced, telling passengers to stay seated and buckle up. Rhonda did as told. She placed her notebook in the seat pocket and sat upright, hands resting on her lap. The woman beside her, a young mother named Camille, based on the diaper bag's name tag, held her baby a little tighter. The infant began to fuss, small whimpers rising with each bump. Rhonda glanced over. Camille's face was tense, lips pressed together, rocking the baby gently but unsure. When the oxygen masks dropped briefly in a mechanical glitch, several passengers gasped. Rhonda didn't panic. Her hands moved instinctively. She unbuckled, reached across to help Camille secure the mask over the baby's face, her fingers swift and steady. Then, like she had done 1,000 times in trauma rooms, she adjusted the mother's strap, speaking low, steady words. It's all right. Just keep breathing with her. Slow. Like that. Seconds later, the masks retracted. The plane steadied. Rhonda returned to her seat, but before she could fasten her belt again, a sharp voice snapped from behind. Ma'am, that was completely out of line. Rhonda turned. Kelly stood there, lips tight, arms crossed. Passengers are not permitted to interfere with safety procedures. That's a federal violation. Rhonda blinked, stunned. She was panicking, she said, nodding toward Camille. Her baby couldn't breathe. I helped, that's all. Kelly's smile was tight and unkind. That's not your role. We have professionals on board to handle emergencies. I am a professional, Rhonda said calmly. I've worked trauma response for over 2 decades. I know what I'm doing. Kelly didn't answer. She just shook her head, muttered something under her breath, and scribbled a note on the back of a slip from her apron. You'll be reported to the captain, she said, sliding the note onto Rhonda's tray without another word. Camille looked horrified. I'm so sorry, she whispered. You helped us. You helped her. Her baby had fallen asleep again, chest rising in soft little sighs. Rhonda nodded, her voice gentle. You don't need to apologize. Some people see a nurse and think we're servants, not protectors. As Kelly walked away, she leaned toward another attendant at the back of the plane and whispered loudly enough to hear. That's why I don't trust people who play hero in scrubs. They always push boundaries. Rhonda heard it. So did the man across the aisle, mid-50s, gray blazer, business laptop open. He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly, but said nothing. Rhonda kept her gaze low, face unreadable, but inside, a quiet ache pressed in her chest. Not because of what Kelly said, but because of how familiar it all felt. How practiced some people were at putting others in their place without ever raising their voice. Rhonda had been seated, calm, respectful, and still somehow she had become a problem. She turned her face back toward the window, eyes blinking slowly, holding back the same tired sting that had followed her through hospital hallways, patient complaints filed too late, and doctors who addressed male interns before her. She pressed her palm against her leg again, not from tension, just to feel something solid, something true. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight moved into cruising altitude. Tray tables clicked. Seatbelts stayed fastened. Somewhere up front, someone chuckled at a movie. But in row 14, everything felt still, tight, like the air was holding its breath. Rhonda Bell sat frozen, her hands resting on her thighs, palms down, steadying herself. She hadn't touched the warning slip that Kelly had left on her tray. It sat there like an unwanted gift, mocking her in silence. Her name was written in sloppy ink, misspelled as Rhonda Bale. No badge number, no timestamp, just vague words. Interfered with safety protocol. Will follow up. She stared at it for a long time. Rhonda had been through worse. Much worse. A gunshot victim bleeding out on a stretcher. A mother sobbing after being told her child didn't make it. 12-hour shifts without food or rest. She could handle pressure. She was trained to. But this slow, deliberate unseeing, being looked at like she didn't belong, like she was a threat for helping a frightened child, this wasn't new. It was just more quiet, more polished. And maybe that's why it hurt more. She reached for her coat on her lap and tucked the slip inside the inside pocket. She didn't crumple it. She folded it neatly, as if keeping a record. She always kept records. Beside her, Camille hadn't said much since the masks retracted. Her baby was asleep again, cheeks flushed, breathing slow. Camille leaned closer now, her voice low. "I should have said something," she whispered. "You helped us. You really did." Rhonda smiled softly. "You had your hands full," she replied. "And you noticed. That's more than most." Camille looked like she wanted to say more but didn't know how. Her eyes filled with guilt. Rhonda reached for her own water bottle, unscrewed the cap, then held it without drinking. She could feel eyes watching her. Not many, but a few. A man across the aisle, a teenager a few rows back. Their looks weren't cruel, just confused, like they'd felt something shift in the air and weren't sure if they were supposed to care. Rhonda had seen that look before too, in break rooms and conference panels. The quiet, "Is this really happening?" look. The silent debate. Do I speak or do I stay in my safe lane? She took a slow sip of water. It tasted warm, flat. Her stomach turned gently, not from the water but from the weight of the moment. She felt her body there, heavy in the seat. Her heart wasn't racing. There was no panic. Just a tired hum behind her ribs. A tiredness deeper than exhaustion. A tiredness that came from having to explain her worth over and over, only to be disbelieved again. The man across the aisle finally spoke, soft and cautious. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Rhonda turned to him. His voice didn't match his posture. He looked uncertain, like he hadn't meant to get involved but couldn't shake the guilt. She nodded once. "I'm okay," she said, even though she wasn't. He nodded back, then returned to his laptop. Rhonda turned her face to the window. She couldn't see anything, just the faint reflection of her own face in the dark glass. Her eyes looked tired. Her curls were pulled back too tight. She had meant to redo them before the flight, but ran late after finishing up at the hospital. As she looked at herself, the face staring back wasn't angry. It was used to this. That was the saddest part. She closed her eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to rest her thoughts. But her mind wouldn't still. It pulled up memories like old bruises rising to the surface. She remembered her first month as a nurse, when a surgeon had mistaken her for janitorial staff and asked her to mop up a spill. She remembered the old woman in room 7 who refused her care because she didn't want someone like her touching her. She remembered staying silent more times than she could count. Not because she was weak, but because speaking always came with a cost. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. One tap. Pause. Another. The rhythm gave her something to hold on to, something she could control. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached into the small crossbody bag tucked beneath her seat. Inside was her ID badge from Memorial Heights Medical Center. Behind it, an older, worn card. A laminated certification from the National Emergency Nurse Board. And tucked behind that, something newer. A printed contact sheet for a program she'd quietly joined last year, the Federal Nursing Council's Civil Rights and Safety Division, just in case. She pulled it out. Her thumb hovered over a name, Deputy Marshal Antoine Briggs. Rhonda didn't know if he was on this flight, but he was assigned to the Southeast Travel Corridor. And the message box next to his name was green. Still, she didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, she looked down at her scrubs. Clean, pressed, navy blue. No stains, no wrinkles, not a sign of chaos or panic. She had done nothing wrong, but somehow she was still the one under suspicion, and that was always the part that hurt the most. The plane moved through the clouds with a soft hum, but inside Rhonda Bell, Everything felt sharp and unsettled. She shifted slightly in her seat, not from discomfort, but from a quiet, growing sense that something was unraveling, not outside, but inside her. The kind of unraveling that didn't happen all at once. It crept, like a thread pulling loose in the dark. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, her hands still resting on her lap. Her fingertips lightly touched the edge of her coat pocket, where Kelly's warning slip now sat, folded and silent. It was just paper, ink on cheap cardstock. But it weighed more than it should have. Not because of what it said, but because of what it meant, what it implied. That her calm, measured help had been rewritten into a violation. That she, not the system, had done something wrong. Camille was asleep now, slumped gently against the window, her baby nestled on her chest. Rhonda envied that kind of peace, the kind that came with not yet learning the cost of being visible in the wrong way. She didn't blame the young mother, but it reminded her of how long she had carried this quiet burden. Not just today, not just on this flight, but through years of steady, silent defiance. She remembered once, on a hospital night shift, when an administrator came into the trauma bay during a code blue. Rhonda had been leading compressions, her voice firm, issuing orders. The administrator had pulled her aside later and said, "You give instructions like a doctor." Rhonda had smiled politely and replied, "No, I give instructions like a nurse." It had taken years to claim that kind of authority. And yet, all it took was one flight attendant's smirk to shake it again. Her phone sat on airplane mode in the seat pocket. She couldn't message anyone, not yet. But her mind worked methodically, like it always did in emergencies. Not fast, not frantic, just thorough. Assess, confirm, act. Her eyes moved across the aisle again. The man with the laptop, late 50s salt and pepper beard, wedding band on his left hand, had his screen tilted just enough for her to see a line graph. He was working, watching markets or numbers or something else that moved in neat, logical rows. She wondered how often people like him felt invisible. He caught her glance and gave a small nod. Not sympathy, not friendliness, just acknowledgement. It was something. Small, but something. Behind her, she heard a soft laugh. Kelly's voice. That same tight, sugary tone she used when addressing passengers she considered important. Rhonda didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the line in the air. The invisible barrier between those who were allowed to relax and those who were expected to stay quiet. Kelly passed her row again, walking slowly, balancing a tray with bottled waters and snack packets. As she reached row 13, she leaned over with a wide smile. "Would you like sparkling or still?" she asked the woman in the aisle seat. The woman chose sparkling. Kelly handed it to her with 2 napkins and a polite nod. Then she skipped row 14 entirely. Rhonda watched, her heart steady but her thoughts rising. The man in 14C, the same row as her, looked surprised. He leaned toward Kelly, gesturing. "Excuse me, can I get a water too?" Kelly blinked, like she hadn't expected the request. "Oh, of course," she said, her voice tightening just a little. She handed him a bottle, no napkin this time, then continued walking. She didn't acknowledge Rhonda. Not a glance. Not a word. The man looked toward Rhonda, confused. "Did she—" he started. Rhonda shook her head. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm not thirsty." She wasn't lying. She wasn't thirsty. But she was tired, in the way that went beyond the body. Tired in her ribs, in her bones, in the part of her that had once believed kindness alone could fix anything. The tray clattered slightly as Kelly moved up the aisle. More laughter, more glasses, more comfort, all handed out with the smooth rhythm of someone who knew exactly where to pour their energy and exactly where to withhold it. Rhonda looked back at her bag. The name was still there. Deputy Marshal Antoine Briggs. She tapped her finger against the laminated card. Once, twice, her thumb hovered over the message field. She didn't want to escalate things. That's what they always said. Don't escalate. Don't make it bigger than it is. Don't cause trouble. But maybe that was the point. It was already big. She just hadn't made it visible yet. Rhonda let out a long, slow breath through her nose. Then she tapped. A green check mark appeared. Message sent. The cabin remained dim, with only the overhead reading lights flickering here and there like quiet beacons. Most passengers were settling into their in-flight routines, watching movies, dozing with neck pillows, sipping small cups of wine. But Rhonda Bell sat upright, motionless, her hands folded gently on her lap as if she were back in a hospital waiting room, waiting not for a diagnosis, but for a decision. The message she sent had left her phone less than 5 minutes ago. No reply yet. Not that she expected one right away. Deputy Marshal Antoine Briggs wasn't the type to reply with casual texts or empty words. He was methodical, measured. She'd only met him once during a healthcare safety training conference where she'd spoken about bias in patient care. He'd approached her afterward, complimented her calm demeanor, and handed her his card in case she ever needed someone who sees the whole picture. She had kept the card tucked behind her ID ever since. Still, pressing send wasn't easy. Her mind played its usual game, that long inner debate that came every time she had to weigh her dignity against the price of speaking up. Was it enough to report? Would anyone believe her? Was she being sensitive? Would it turn into something bigger than she wanted? Would it follow her home? That last question lingered. Things like this never stayed neatly in the moment. They left traces, in side glances at future flights, in policy notes, in the way a colleague might say, "She's a little hard to please," without ever hearing her side. And yet, if she stayed silent, this would keep happening. To her, to others. Quiet bias didn't stop because it was ignored. It grew in the silence. A soft ding interrupted her thoughts. The seatbelt light flashed briefly, then disappeared. The captain announced they were cruising over Tennessee. 2 more hours until landing in Atlanta. Rhonda shifted in her seat and adjusted her coat, feeling the folded paper inside. Her fingers paused there for a moment, touching the slip as if trying to draw strength from its sharp edges. Then she looked up and locked eyes with Kelly. The flight attendant was standing a few rows ahead, speaking softly to a couple who had just woken up. But something about the way she glanced back at Rhonda was different now, like she sensed something had changed, like she'd felt a shift in control she couldn't name. It was brief, a flicker. Then she turned away, still smiling, still performing for the others. Rhonda sat back, eyes scanning the cabin. Most people hadn't noticed anything unusual. That was the power of subtle discrimination. It didn't scream. It whispered. It blended in with routine. It dressed itself as company policy or miscommunication. And by the time anyone noticed, the damage had already settled into someone's skin. Her eyes landed on the young man in row 12, a teenager with earbuds and a black hoodie. He'd been watching quietly. Their eyes met for a second. He gave a small nod. Nothing dramatic. But his gaze wasn't empty. It said, "I saw it." And somehow that helped. Not in a fix-everything way, but in the way that made her feel less alone. Another ding. This one was quieter, coming from her smartwatch. Rhonda glanced down. A soft green notification lit up on the screen. One word. Received. No long message, no dramatic alert. But she knew what it meant. Marshal Briggs was on the flight. Her heart didn't race, her hands didn't shake. She'd lived through enough nights in trauma bays to know the difference between fear and readiness. What she felt now was something quieter, a resolve settling into place like a final puzzle piece. She looked ahead. Nothing had changed visibly. The flight attendant still moved between rows, refilling drinks, adjusting blankets. The man across the aisle had fallen asleep, chin resting on his hand. And yet everything felt different, because now she wasn't the only one who saw. Rhonda leaned her head against the window, eyes open, watching nothing but darkness outside. The wing lights blinked softly against the clouds. Somewhere behind her, quiet justice had begun to take its first steps. No shouting, no warning, just presence, seen and unseen. And Kelly, still smiling, still skipping her row, had no idea that the air had shifted. Not just for this flight, but for her. The flight continued in silence, but for Rhonda Bell, every sound in the cabin had sharpened. Every click of a seatbelt, every shuffle of feet, every polite exchange between flight attendants and other passengers. It wasn't noise, it was awareness. She sat perfectly still, but inside her, something had begun to wake up. Not rage, not panic, but that quiet, powerful thing that comes when you know you're no longer isolated in what you're feeling, when someone else sees it too. Still, she didn't relax. She couldn't. That wasn't how her mind worked. Years in the ER had trained her to read every detail, every pattern, to expect what others missed. And right now she could feel something building. It wasn't visible. It wasn't loud. But it was there, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Kelly had passed by twice since the green light on Rhonda's watch had blinked. Both times she hadn't spoken. Not to her, not even a glance. But the performance for everyone else had grown even more polished. She knelt by an elderly man's seat to adjust his blanket. She offered chocolates from a small tray to a pair of businessmen, smiling as if she were hosting a gala instead of running a flight. She bent slightly more, tilted her voice higher, touched wrists when handing drinks, all signs of a woman who had crafted her public face to perfection. And yet, she was avoiding row 14. It wasn't subtle anymore. Rhonda noticed that the man in 14C, who still hadn't finished his bottle of water, kept glancing her way. He looked uncomfortable, like he was trying to make sense of something he couldn't quite name. Like he wanted to say something, but didn't know the words. Rhonda wasn't angry with him. She knew that look. She had worn it once herself. Long ago, when she was young and still believed most people meant well if you gave them enough time. But time didn't erase silence. It only made it more permanent. Camille stirred beside her. The baby shifted slightly, letting out a quiet cry before nestling deeper into her mother's arms. Camille opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the cabin lights. "You all right?" she asked, her voice groggy, her eyes still filled with sleep. Rhonda nodded. "We're over Tennessee now, about halfway." Camille looked down at her daughter, smoothing the little girl's curls with the back of her hand. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, Has she said anything else to you?" Rhonda paused. "Number. But she doesn't have to." Camille swallowed, her expression tightening. "I should have said something earlier, when she gave you that paper." I froze. Rhonda shook her head gently. "You had your child to protect. That's not freezing, that's surviving." There was a long pause between them, a silence that didn't need to be filled. Camille reached into her diaper bag and pulled out a soft cloth to wipe her daughter's mouth. Her hands were shaking just slightly. Rhonda's voice dropped lower, steady. "Don't carry shame for something someone else chose to do." Camille nodded, but her eyes brimmed. "I just hate how quiet it was, like we were all supposed to pretend it wasn't happening." Rhonda looked ahead, her eyes settling on the curtain that separated the economy section from the galley. "That's how it works," she said. "The silence is the shield, not just for her, but for the whole system." Camille didn't speak again, but she didn't look away either. Then, a new voice broke through the calm. "Miss Bell?" Rhonda turned. A man stood near the aisle, tall, bald, dressed in a charcoal gray sweater and navy slacks. He looked like any other passenger, except for the small black earpiece in his left ear and the lanyard badge half tucked into his waistband. He didn't flash it. He didn't need to. It was Antoine Briggs. His eyes were steady, his expression unreadable. But there was something in the way he stood, slightly angled, giving her space, not crowding, not performing, that told her he knew exactly what was happening here. Not just the surface details, but the texture of it, the unspoken layers. Rhonda straightened in her seat. Her voice was calm. "Yes?" "I won't stay long. he said softly. "Just needed to confirm you're safe, and that you don't require anything at this time." His words were official, rehearsed, the kind used in protocol. But his eyes said something different. "You were right to speak, and I've seen this before." "I'm fine," Rhonda said. "For now." He gave a single nod. "Understood." He turned, heading back toward the front of the cabin, slow and casual, as if he'd just stretched his legs. To anyone watching, he was just another traveler walking to the lavatory. But to Rhonda, it was confirmation. She wasn't alone now, and whatever came next wouldn't disappear when the wheels touched down. She folded her hands again and rested her head lightly against the window. She didn't close her eyes this time. She wanted to see everything. Rhonda Bell stayed still, her head turned toward the cabin window, though there was nothing to see beyond the glass. Just darkness, soft and endless, broken only by the blinking red light on the wing. The world outside felt quiet, but inside the aircraft, she could feel a kind of electricity building, subtle, charged, like air before a lightning strike. She kept her body calm. No sudden movements, no shifting. Only her fingers moved, gently stroking the edge of her coat sleeve, as if she were smoothing fabric that had never wrinkled. Antoine Briggs was real. He had stood there beside her seat, eyes steady, tone professional, but his presence had been a declaration. Rhonda didn't need fanfare. She didn't want confrontation. She just needed someone to recognize the weight of what had been done without calling it something else, without minimizing it, without flipping the script and asking if she had misunderstood. She had spent a lifetime being asked to explain herself in rooms that already decided she didn't belong. This wasn't about a drink, or a skipped menu, or even that insulting slip left on her tray. It was about the subtle way Kelly Bowers had let everyone around her know, in small, deliberate actions, that Rhonda wasn't equal in that cabin, that her presence required control, policing, that her kindness, her silence, her calm were irrelevant. They always push boundaries. That sentence kept echoing. Rhonda had heard it before, not always in those words, but in the tone. In how a supervisor might tell her she was very direct when all she did was ask a clear question. In how a physician might raise an eyebrow when she challenged an outdated protocol, only to later repeat the exact same suggestion as if it were his own. In how some patients refused her care unless it was an emergency, when it was too late to care who saved them. Now here, at 35,000 feet, she had been reclassified with a single smirk and a paper slip. And yet, no matter how often it happened, the part that hurt wasn't the insult itself. It was the way others let it sit, unchallenged, floating in the air like nothing had happened. That's what slowly eroded you. Not the strike, the silence. She turned slightly, just enough to look down the aisle. Kelly was still moving about, making her rounds with the kind of poise that suggested complete comfort. She leaned in toward passengers when she spoke, laughed softly, offered refills like it was a luxury tasting room instead of a mid-tier commercial flight. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. Something had shifted. Rhonda noticed it now. The way Kelly's hands fidgeted more at the drink cart, the way her glances down the cabin became less fluid, more calculated. She was searching for something, or someone. Likely wondering if the sudden presence of Antoine Briggs meant more than it appeared. She wouldn't say anything, of course. She'd stay composed. That's what people like her did. They hid behind policy and practiced customer service tones. Because confrontation wasn't their way, until it came for them. Across the aisle, the man with the salt and pepper beard had put away his laptop. His posture was more upright now, hands folded in front of him, eyes flicking toward Rhonda every so often. When she glanced at him briefly, he offered a nod, more direct this time. Not pity, not curiosity. Just a quiet signal. I'm paying attention. It mattered. She didn't need a savior, but she needed witnesses. Injustice, when left unwitnessed, became memory, and memory alone didn't create change. But when enough people saw it, really saw it, then silence started to crack. Camille stirred again and gave Rhonda a soft, uncertain smile. Her baby was still asleep, but she reached across gently and touched Rhonda's wrist. "Thank you again," she whispered. Rhonda turned her palm upward, returning the touch with calm fingers. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "You just have to remember." There was a pause between them, the kind of pause that made space for understanding. Camille bit her lip and looked toward the front of the plane. "Something's happening, isn't it?" Rhonda's eyes didn't move. She kept her gaze ahead, voice level. "Not yet, but it will." Behind them, a voice came over the intercom. A standard announcement, delivered in the captain's easy tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Atlanta in about 40 minutes. Please remain seated until the seatbelt light is on. Thank you for flying with us." It was ordinary, but to Rhonda it felt like the start of a clock. She adjusted her coat, smoothed the creases, sat up straighter, not tense, not braced for a fight, just prepared, because she knew how these things unfolded. First came the looks, then the discomfort, then the effort to minimize, then the quiet scramble to restore order. Not justice, just comfort for the ones who caused the harm. But this time, order would not return on their terms. This time, someone had noticed. And Kelly Bowers, who had handed out drinks and smiles while skipping a single woman in scrubs, was about to realize that her choices hadn't gone unseen. Rhonda didn't move, didn't signal anyone. She just looked forward, calm and unshaken, as the engines hummed softly and the world outside began to rise up toward the plane. She had done nothing but help a mother calm her baby. And now, the sky itself felt like it was tilting back in her direction. The first sign that something had shifted came in the form of movement, not loud, not rushed, but deliberate. As the flight began its slow descent, the cabin lights brightened just a touch. Passengers stirred in their seats, adjusting reclines, reaching for carry-ons. There was that usual soft rustle of end-of-flight energy, people preparing to land, minds shifting from clouds to concrete. But in row 14, Rhonda Bell remained still, her posture quiet but alert, like a nurse watching vitals in the seconds before something changes. From the corner of her eye, she noticed it. Kelly Bowers walking up the aisle, clipboard in hand. No cart this time, no snacks or drinks. Just the performance of order. She was stopping at random rows now, asking about service, jotting notes. Her face was tight, polite. Too polite, like a mask worn a little too long. Rhonda's breath slowed as Kelly approached. "Hi there," Kelly said sweetly to the man in 14C, her tone light. "Just checking in before landing. Was everything all right with your flight today?" The man blinked. He hesitated. Yes. Fine." Kelly smiled, then turned slightly, just enough to glance at Rhonda. Their eyes met for half a second. Kelly's expression flickered, too fast to name but not fast enough to hide. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then, pretending as if she'd forgotten something, she took a sharp step back and moved on to the next row. Rhonda didn't look away. She watched Kelly retreat, the back of her pressed uniform, her heels clicking a little too fast. That was the thing about people like Kelly. They were confident when the power was on their side, when silence protected them. But the moment they sensed scrutiny, real scrutiny, they grew cautious, defensive, because deep down they knew they'd been skating on assumptions, not merit. Rhonda's hands stayed folded over her coat. Inside the inner pocket, the folded slip still pressed against the fabric, not shredded, not discarded, just there, waiting. She heard the quiet buzz of the intercom again, this time from a different voice, male, calm, director. "Ladies and gentlemen, for the remainder of the flight, we ask all passengers to remain in their seats with seatbelts securely fastened. Flight attendants will complete final checks shortly." The tone was slightly different than earlier, slightly more official, controlled. Camille sat up straighter. "That's new," she whispered. Rhonda didn't answer. She didn't need to. Across the aisle, the man who had offered her a nod earlier now looked fully alert. He closed his laptop and sat back, eyes forward, watching. Not out of fear, but focus. Something was forming. And Kelly felt it too. She had stopped moving up and down the aisle. Instead, she now stood near the front galley, speaking in low tones to another flight attendant. They kept their voices hushed, but even from this distance, Rhonda could see the tension in Kelly's shoulders. The way her arms stayed folded tight across her chest, clipboard pressed against her ribs like a shield. Rhonda leaned back into her seat and exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her lungs steady and deep. Her eyes closed just for a moment, not to sleep but to center herself. It wasn't that she wanted Kelly to be humiliated. That was never the goal. She didn't want apologies or fake kindness, or someone suddenly pretending to care. What she wanted was clarity, for someone to finally say, yes, this happened. Yes, it was wrong. Yes, it stops now. Too many times people like Kelly got to walk away untouched, because their words were careful, their smiles were polished, their bias wore a name tag and a practiced script. And people like Rhonda, they were expected to take it, to smile through it, to rise above, to keep proving day after day that they were professionals, not problems, but not today. Rhonda's smartwatch buzzed quietly. She looked down. Message received. Internal review initiated. Cabin observation footage retrieved. Personnel documentation pending. 6 lines, clean, clinical. But they landed heavier than anything else that day. Rhonda's heart didn't race. It settled. Her body felt grounded again, anchored to the leather seat as if she finally weighed what she had always carried. Her identity, her profession, her years of silent tolerance, all of it was no longer invisible. Kelly turned once more to scan the cabin. She didn't look directly at Rhonda, but this time, she didn't need to, because now Kelly knew. Rhonda was not just another woman in scrubs. She was the reason the silence would break. The seatbelt sign dinged on. One final chime before descent. Passengers stirred with familiar movements, closing trays, sliding bags back under seats, adjusting armrests. It was the mechanical part of flying, the instinctive end-of-journey routine. But for Rhonda Bell, the routine felt heavier now. Not because she feared what came next, but because she knew it was already in motion. She sat upright, posture composed, hands resting on her knees. Her coat remained folded neatly in her lap, though she hadn't touched it in nearly an hour. It held that flimsy warning slip, and something about keeping it untouched felt right, like evidence waiting patiently for the world to stop pretending. The cabin lights were now bright enough to show every detail, every line on tired faces, every crack in the smiles of the crew, every forced gesture that used to pass as hospitality. Rhonda noticed it all, and most of all, she noticed Kelly. The flight attendant had retreated into a performance of normalcy, but it no longer fit her as easily. She no longer moved with the same ease. The smile stayed, but it came too quickly and left too soon. She approached row 11 to collect trash but avoided eye contact with anyone in row 14. Her clipboard was gone now, replaced by folded arms and sharp glances that never fully landed. There was a weight pressing behind her gestures, like someone who knew she'd been watched, not by passengers, but by the system she thought would always stay on her side. Rhonda knew that weight well. She had felt it in staff meetings when her words were taken under consideration and then quietly removed from policy drafts. She had felt it during evaluations when her years of leadership were rewritten as independent, but sometimes difficult to manage. She had felt it when newer, less experienced staff were offered roles she had already outgrown, the weight of being correct, but not believed. Today, that weight had shifted, and Kelly was the one feeling it now. Still, Rhonda didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in someone else's discomfort, not for her. She wasn't built that way. She didn't want Kelly to fall apart. She just wanted her to stop standing on the backs of people like her. Her watch buzzed again. Message: Cabin crew ST-401 marked for immediate post-flight debrief. Marshal presence confirmed for post-landing contact. Short. Director. Like the click of a switch being flipped. Rhonda glanced forward. Antoine Briggs had reappeared near the front row. no longer pretending to be just another passenger. He stood with hands lightly folded in front of him, calm, collected. He wasn't staring at anyone, but his presence anchored the aisle like a fixed point, like a silent warning to anyone still pretending they hadn't seen what was unfolding. Camille shifted beside her, adjusting her daughter's blanket and whispering a soft lullaby. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tucked in the child's hood. She looked over at Rhonda, her eyes filled with something unspoken. Relief, guilt, respect, maybe all three. "You okay?" she whispered. Rhonda nodded. "Yeah, I am." And she meant it. Not in the surface level, pass the day kind of way, but deeply. There was a peace she hadn't expected, the kind that came when truth finally stopped asking for permission to exist. Across the aisle, the man with the salt and pepper beard was no longer pretending to read. His tablet was off. His gaze was sharp. He watched Kelly with eyes that didn't blink. The teenager a few rows back had removed his earbuds and leaned forward, elbows on knees, alert. Others were watching too now, not saying anything, but awake. Something about that mattered more than Rhonda could explain. She wasn't just being seen. The pattern was being seen, and that's where the change lived, not in a single act of justice, but in the quiet unraveling of a lie people had lived with for far too long. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt. A wave of exhaled breath filled the cabin, the collective sigh of passengers who had nothing on their minds but ground, bags, schedules. But for Rhonda, the landing meant something else. This wasn't over. It was beginning. The intercom came alive again. This time, it wasn't the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, for safety reasons, we ask passengers in rows 10 through 16 to remain seated while our onboard crew completes a brief compliance check. Thank you for your cooperation." The words were neutral. The message wasn't. Camille froze. Her eyes widened. "Is this—" Rhonda didn't answer. She simply sat tall, hands folded, eyes forward, and just like that, the silence that had once covered everything now felt like the loudest thing in the room. The plane rolled to a slow, steady stop at the gate. Outside the window, Atlanta's early evening light cast long golden streaks across the tarmac. Jet bridges moved into position. Ground crews bustled below, waving signals and connecting hoses. The airport looked as it always did. Orderly, practiced, calm. But inside row 14, Rhonda Bell sat frozen in something far more complex. Her seatbelt was still fastened. She hadn't moved a muscle since the landing. She hadn't even blinked much. The soft announcement requesting passengers from rows 10 through 16 to remain seated had sealed her stillness. The words hadn't been sharp. There was no accusation in their tone. But Rhonda knew their weight. That voice had marked a boundary. Not punishment, not yet. But pause. Assessment. And that was enough to shift everything. Camille's breathing had changed beside her. It was shallow now, small and careful. She clutched her daughter a little tighter, whispering something too quiet to hear, her lips pressed to the baby's curls. She didn't speak to Rhonda, but her shoulder brushed against hers, a soft, steady presence. Rhonda didn't pull away. She needed it more than she'd admit. Across the aisle, the man with the salt and pepper beard had removed his glasses. He held them in his lap now, watching the front of the cabin with the kind of focus you'd see in a courtroom. Controlled, measured, ready to speak, if it came to that. No one else had moved. Not from rows 10 to 16. It was strange how still a group of people could become when they sensed something was happening. Not chaos, not noise. Just something true and important, making its way forward. Then it happened. Two figures boarded the aircraft. They came in fast, but not aggressive. No stomping boots, no loud voices. Just presence. One wore a blazer and an ID badge clipped to his chest. The other carried a small digital tablet and a folder marked in red, Stratus Internal Compliance. Rhonda didn't flinch. They weren't coming for her. They moved down the aisle with quiet precision until they reached row 15. Then, without warning, they turned and faced the galley at the front, where Kelly Bowers stood with her hands behind her back, smiling too widely at nothing. "Miss Bowers," the man with the badge said, his voice level but audible. "Please gather your belongings and step toward the rear cabin. We'll escort you to the debriefing area now." The plane did not make a sound, not at first. Then came a soft intake of breath from somewhere in row 11. A whispered, "Wait, what?" from the teenager behind. Even the baby on Camille's chest turned her head, eyes blinking open. Kelly didn't move at first. Her smile cracked, just slightly. Then she let out a small, brittle laugh. "Is this about the report? There must be. I followed protocol." The man with the folder didn't blink. "Miss Bowers, now." Kelly's gaze darted briefly down the aisle, maybe looking for backup or someone to protest on her behalf. But no one moved. Even her fellow crew member, a younger man near the back, kept his head down, pretending to organize trash bags that didn't need organizing. And then, Kelly looked at Rhonda. For the first time, really looked. Not past her, not through her, but directly at her. There was no apology in her face, no realization, just confusion, as if she still didn't understand what had happened, as if she truly believed that smiling while skipping someone's row, misreporting a helpful act, and offering service only to the ones who looked like her, wasn't enough to trigger consequence. But it had. Rhonda didn't return the stare. She didn't owe her that. Instead, she looked ahead, her jaw relaxed, her breath slow. Kelly finally moved. She walked the length of the aisle with the two agents behind her, her steps tight and fast. Not dragged, not forced, but no longer in control either. When she passed Rhonda's row, her head turned slightly, but her eyes didn't meet anyone's. Not anymore. And just like that, she was gone. The air changed after she left. Not in a loud, celebratory way. Not with whispers or claps or sideways grins. Just a slow, collective release, like the entire cabin had been holding something in, and now, finally, it was allowed to breathe again. A pause. Then a second announcement came through, this one from Antoine Briggs. "We'd like to thank all passengers for your cooperation during that delay. You may now begin deplaning from front to back. Please remain courteous to fellow passengers as you exit." Click. The intercom went silent. Rhonda didn't move. Camille turned to her, eyes wide. "Is it really over?" Rhonda gave a small, quiet smile. Not of triumph, but of truth. Number. But it started. Passengers began to stand now. Bags came down. Seatbelts unclicked. Movement returned. As Rhonda slowly reached for her bag, the man across the aisle leaned in, voice low. "I saw all of it. If they need a statement, I'll give one." Rhonda looked at him, this man whose name she didn't know, and said softly, "Thank you." He nodded once and stepped into the aisle. Rhonda rose, her coat folded over her arm, her badge still clipped to her chest, and the warning slip still tucked inside her pocket. Not as a symbol of shame, but proof. Proof that the silence had finally met resistance. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel tired. She felt seen. The cabin buzzed with the low sounds of passengers rising, zippers, polite goodbyes, overhead bins clicking open one by one. It was the kind of background noise that usually marked the end of a journey. But for Rhonda Bell, this moment didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something had cracked open. She stepped into the aisle with quiet purpose, adjusting her coat over her left arm, sliding her bag onto her shoulder. Her knees ached faintly from sitting too long, but she ignored it. The hum of voices around her had changed, softened somehow. People weren't talking over her or around her. There was a new kind of pause when she passed, not out of pity, not discomfort, but acknowledgement. And yet, Rhonda stayed quiet. She had no need to announce anything. The system had already spoken for her. Camille stood just behind her, baby resting on her shoulder now, small arms curled around her mother's neck. She looked at Rhonda as they waited to move forward in the slow shuffle toward the exit. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't on this flight," she said softly. She scared me. Rhonda turned gently to face her. She scared you because she knew how to smile while dismissing you. That's the worst kind. You start thinking maybe it's you. Camille's eyes filled. Yeah, she whispered. Exactly that. Rhonda touched her arm lightly. You don't owe anyone silence, Camille, not even on an airplane. Ahead, passengers began filing out into the jet bridge. Antoine Briggs now stood near the cockpit door, off to the side, speaking quietly with a uniformed agent. He looked up as Rhonda approached. Their eyes met, and this time, he didn't nod like an official. He nodded like a man who understood. Thank you, he said under his breath, for trusting it would be handled. Rhonda gave a small, tired smile. Thank you for not needing an audience to do your job. Antoine's lips twitched slightly at the corners. Almost a smile, almost not. If you'd like to file an official statement, the compliance office will reach out. I left everything they need, she replied. In writing. I don't need to tell it twice. He stepped aside, allowing her to pass. The jet bridge was colder than expected, the air stiff and mechanical. Rhonda tightened her coat at the collar. People in front of her moved in waves, disappearing into the terminal like water disappearing into sand. She kept her pace steady, her back straight. As she stepped into the terminal, the sound shifted. Brighter, harsher, the chaos of an airport evening in full swing. Boarding calls, luggage wheels, children laughing. And none of it knew what had just happened behind that plane door. She moved past a row of windows and caught her own reflection. The polished floor, the clear glass, both showed a woman in navy scrubs, no makeup, curls pulled back, eyes that carried both history and restraint. She paused for just a second. This was how change looked. Not polished, not angry, just permanent. A few steps later, a woman in a gray business suit fell into stride beside her. Rhonda noticed her from the cabin. She had been seated several rows back, barely visible. The woman hesitated, then spoke. I'm sorry, Miss Bell, is it? Rhonda turned. Yes? The woman pushed her hair behind one ear. Her voice was soft but steady. I work in HR compliance for a regional airline. I wasn't on duty tonight, but I saw everything. I just want to say, you weren't wrong. I've seen how they cover for people like her. Rhonda tilted her head. And now? The woman took a breath. Now. I'll be writing a full report, and I won't let them water it down. Rhonda studied her. Make sure you don't let them tell you it was just a misunderstanding. I won't, she promised. They parted at the escalators. Rhonda took the stairs, not because she had to, but because something in her needed to move under her own power, to feel her weight, to take each step without being carried or pulled. At the bottom, a shuttle waited to take her to baggage claim. She climbed in and sat near the back, watching the doors close one by one. A little boy stared at her from across the aisle, holding his father's hand. She smiled at him gently. He didn't smile back, but he didn't look away. The shuttle lurched forward. Rhonda looked out the window. The dark sky outside still hung heavy over the airport, the city's lights blinking like slow, thoughtful reminders. She felt something shift in her chest. Not pride, not even relief, but certainty. This time her silence hadn't protected someone else's comfort. It had protected her truth. And the next time a woman like her stepped into row 14 wearing scrubs and soft shoes, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be met with fear. Maybe it would be met with respect. The shuttle door slid open with a slow hiss. Rhonda Bell stepped off carefully, heels clicking against the polished floor of the terminal's lower level. The air felt different down here, colder, more industrial, filled with the scent of engine oil and distant food court grease. Baggage claim screens blinked overhead, announcing arrival after arrival in neat rows of glowing green text. Her flight number was listed near the top. Carousel 5. She moved toward it without urgency. The passengers around her buzzed with normal conversation, talking about dinner plans, rental cars, missed connections. No one knew what had just happened above them in that pressurized cabin. No one knew about the quiet confrontation, the slip of paper in her pocket, the escort of a flight attendant who never thought she'd be held accountable. That was always the strange part. These things happened in plain view, but the world kept moving as if they hadn't. Rhonda had learned to live with that. But today, she didn't have to. As she approached Carousel 5, the belt hadn't started yet. The crowd had gathered loosely in a half circle, faces half tired, half focused. Rhonda stood at the edge, letting her bag shoulders sag gently as her eyes scanned the space. Her mind wasn't on her suitcase. It was still replaying the moment Kelly was led down the aisle, still hearing that brittle tone, the confusion in her voice. "I followed protocol." Rhonda had heard that phrase so many times it had lost meaning. Protocol, policy, miscommunication, all tools people use to clean up the mess of their bias, to soften the impact, to escape accountability. But what Kelly never understood was that harm didn't need to come in the form of slurs or shouted orders. Sometimes it came in the shape of a cold voice, a withheld menu, a shrug. And sometimes, when it's been happening for years, that's the version that cuts deepest. The conveyor belt whirred to life with a clank. The first few bags tumbled out. Rhonda's eyes drifted toward the exit doors across the terminal. She wasn't in a rush to leave, but her heart had begun to ache in a way that felt bone deep. A slow ache, a quiet one. Not grief, not fear. Just the weight of having to hold it together again. Even when justice had technically been served. Even when it ended in her favor, it still cost her something. It always did. She thought about calling someone, a friend, a colleague, maybe her sister Eliza, who always said, "You don't have to be strong every damn minute, Roan." But she didn't pull out her phone. Not yet. There was a strange stillness in her chest that needed space, not sound. Space to process what it meant to walk off that plane not just angry or insulted, but validated. That was new. And it scared her more than she expected, because now she knew what it felt like when the system didn't look away, and part of her, the tired part, worried it wouldn't happen again. That this was a rare alignment, a lucky break, a moment she'd have to carry like armor the next time someone like Kelly tried to cut her down with a smirk and a clipboard. Behind her, a voice broke the hum of luggage wheels. "Miss Bell?" She turned slowly. It was the same woman from earlier, the HR compliance officer. This time, without the rush of passengers or the sterile silence of the cabin, she looked more grounded, less polished, like the weight of what she'd seen had finally caught up to her. Rhonda waited. "I just spoke to the review lead," the woman said. "They're pulling previous incident reports from that crew member. 2 go back over a year." Rhonda raised her brows, but said nothing. "She had a pattern," the woman added. "But nothing ever stuck. This time it will." Rhonda held her gaze for a long second. Then she said quietly, "It only stuck because someone like me was willing to be treated like a problem to prove the pattern." The woman swallowed. "You're right." There was a pause, then Rhonda asked, "Do you think she understands what she did?" The woman looked down, then back up. "I don't know, but maybe it's not about her anymore." Rhonda nodded once. "That's the part people don't get. I didn't want her punished. I just wanted the harm to stop." The woman didn't respond. She didn't need to. Another bag slammed onto the belt, and Rhonda spotted her suitcase. Black, worn at the edges, a yellow ribbon tied around the handle like always. She stepped forward, lifted it smoothly, and wheeled it toward the exit. As she walked, the weight of the day began to settle differently in her chest. It didn't crush her like it usually did. It just sat there like something that had finally been named out loud. She passed the automatic doors, the thick glass parting with a low groan. The city air hit her face, warm, sticky, and alive. A line of taxis waited at the curb, engines idling. She didn't get in one yet. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the suitcase handle, the wind brushing the edge of her collar. She thought of every nurse who'd been dismissed, every woman who'd sat in row 14 and never said a word, every child watching their mother shrink under someone's polite hostility. And she knew Tonight wasn't just about her. It never really was. Rhonda Bell stood at the curb beneath the terminal's steel overhang, her suitcase upright beside her, its wheels locked in place like a second spine. The night air was thick with heat, still clinging from the day, and carried the scent of fuel and distant rain. The kind of heat that settled behind your ears and at the back of your knees. She didn't mind it. Not tonight. Taxis lined up like quiet yellow ghosts, headlights glowing, drivers tapping steering wheels with bored fingers, waiting for their next name, their next destination. A young woman to her left climbed into a car with flowers in hand. A man with a Bluetooth headset barked into his phone as he pushed a cart full of golf clubs into a van. Everyone was going somewhere. Everyone had already moved on. Rhonda hadn't. She stayed rooted, not because she was stuck, but because part of her needed a minute longer to absorb what had just happened. Her legs could carry her forward, sure, but her mind was still in that aisle, still hearing the click of the intercom, still seeing Kelly's face shift from power to panic. There was a feeling growing in her chest, but she didn't have a name for it. It wasn't triumph. She hadn't won a prize. She hadn't defeated a villain. It was quieter than that. Deeper. It felt like confirmation that the world she kept trying to explain to people, one where you were polite and competent and still treated like a risk, did exist. That someone finally acknowledged it without asking her to shrink her voice to get there. But alongside that feeling was something sharper. Not bitterness. Not quite. Grief. She couldn't deny it. For every time she had swallowed her pride to keep a job, for every eye roll she'd absorbed with a half smile, for every, "Are you sure that's what happened?" she had ever had to sit through while pretending she didn't already know the answer. Tonight had proven she wasn't imagining it. And somehow, that validation hurt too, because it meant all of it had been real. She pressed her head gently against the window. The cool glass grounded her. Her thoughts drifted to Grace, her goddaughter, whose graduation was tomorrow. That was why she had boarded that flight in the first place. That was what all of this had tried to distract her from. Grace had once told her, during a hospital visit, "You make being strong look easy." Rhonda had smiled and replied, "That's because you never see the cost." Now she thought about what it had cost her today. Not just energy, not just comfort, but something deeper. Vulnerability. The kind of exposure that didn't leave bruises but left you changed. She had stood up for herself in the most restrained way possible. No shouting, no anger, no spectacle, just truth. Quiet and plain. And it had been enough. But it shouldn't have taken that much. She closed her eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, she was too alert for that, but to feel. Really feel what had shifted inside her. There was a deep ache in her chest. Not pain, not sadness exactly. Something older. Like a tension that had been held too long. Like breath that had never been fully released. She remembered vividly the look in Kelly's eyes when she was escorted down the aisle. That frozen shock. Not fear of violence or shame, but the fear of being held to account. And Rhonda, even now, didn't feel spiteful. She felt tired, but under that tiredness there was something steadier, like the pulse of a drum beneath the noise. It was dignity, not the kind people handed out with praise or promotions, the kind you carried inside you, whether anyone saw it or not, the kind that stayed even when you were invisible. She thought about the next flight she'd take, whether the crew would look at her differently, whether her name would quietly be flagged in some system as the nurse who reported. She knew how institutions worked. There would be whispers, perhaps even polite distance. But this time she wouldn't shrink. This time she had chosen to be visible. The cab slowed as it pulled up in front of a modest brick townhouse tucked behind a row of oak trees. Her porch light was on. She always left it that way for herself. It felt like a promise. She paid the driver, nodded her thanks, and stepped out into the quiet evening air. The breeze kissed her cheek, warm and soft. She rolled her suitcase up the steps, each one clicking beneath her heels, the rhythm of return. She paused at the door, slipped the key in, turned the knob, stepped inside. The air in her home smelled like lavender and something faintly citrus, the last traces of the diffuser she'd set before leaving. She dropped her bag gently near the wall to unpack tomorrow. She didn't bother turning on the TV. She didn't check her phone. She walked slowly to the kitchen, opened a cupboard, and pulled out a chipped blue mug. It had belonged to her mother. She filled it with water and stood there, both hands wrapped around it, her reflection dim in the window above the sink. She wasn't crying, but something heavy inside her was finally settling. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something like it. A knowing that what she had done, not loud, not dramatic, not perfect, had mattered. That she had said in every quiet, steady action, "I belong here." I always did. And the world, just this once, had listened. She took a sip of water, placed the mug on the counter, and reached into her coat pocket one last time. She pulled out the warning slip, looked at it under the kitchen light, then slowly, carefully, tore it in half. Not in anger, but in closure. She dropped the pieces in the trash, exhaled through her nose and flicked off the light. And in the quiet hum of her home, Rhonda Bell finally let herself rest. For the first time in a long time, uninterrupted. If this story moved you, make sure to give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming soon. Her watch buzzed. A quiet nudge against her skin. A text from Eliza. "You land safe?" Rhonda stared at the message for a long moment. Her thumb hovered over the reply, but she didn't type anything yet. What would she even say? "Yes, I landed." "Yes, and someone finally got held accountable." "Yes, and something changed." And also, nothing did. She sighed and slid the phone back into her coat pocket. A few steps away, a shuttle driver leaned against a pole, sipping from a thermos. He glanced at her, not in judgment, just curious. She must have looked like she was waiting for someone, but she wasn't. She wasn't even waiting for a cab. She was waiting to feel ready. Ready to re-enter a world that still didn't know what she had carried on that flight. Ready to go back to work, to daily routines, to smiling at people who might still think they'd never do what Kelly did, even while doing it in softer, more polite ways. Ready to be asked by well-meaning coworkers, "How was your trip?" with no idea what that question might cost her to answer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the slip. The warning notice. The warning notice. She unfolded it, slowly, pressing out the crease with her palm. Her name was still misspelled, Rhonda Bale. The handwriting was rushed, almost careless. It didn't even try to look professional. She wondered if Kelly ever thought this would actually be read by someone in authority, or if she assumed it would go unnoticed, like so many others before. Rhonda traced the letters with her finger. Then she folded the slip again and placed it inside her wallet. Not as a trophy, not as evidence, as memory. So she'd never let herself believe it didn't happen. So she wouldn't forget how close she had come once again to being erased. Her phone buzzed a second time. Another message. This one from an unknown number. "This is Senior Agent L. Dorsey from DOT Compliance. If you're willing, we'd like to hear your statement in more detail. The audit will include training records, crew complaints, and flight audio. Your report triggered the investigation. Thank you." Rhonda stared at the screen. She hadn't expected that. Her eyes blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from weight. That sudden realization that her voice had gone further than just the cabin, that it might shape something she couldn't even see. And that scared her too, because part of her wasn't sure she wanted to keep being the one who speaks up. She didn't want to always be the mirror people were forced to look into. She wanted just once to be the person who boarded a flight, sat in her seat, and was left in peace. Not ignored, not tested, not quietly antagonized, just left alone. She looked at the message again. The audit will include training records. A training record. That was something permanent. It meant Kelly's behavior would exist somewhere beyond a hallway whisper, beyond a passenger complaint that went nowhere. It meant the next time someone reviewed her file, they'd see a red flag instead of a gold star. Rhonda slowly typed back, "I'll give my statement. Not for me. For the next nurse." She hit send, and only then did she step toward the curb and raise her hand for a cab. The driver pulled forward with a nod, popping the trunk. Rhonda loaded her suitcase herself and settled into the back seat. The car smelled faintly of pine air freshener and worn leather. As they pulled away from the airport, the terminal lights receded in the rearview mirror. Rhonda leaned her head against the window, eyes half closed, lips parted slightly. For once, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel silenced. She didn't feel erased. She felt like someone who left a mark, and it wasn't loud. It was lasting. The cab moved through the streets of Atlanta with a soft, rhythmic sway. The glow of the city outside the window blurred past in streaks of red and amber. Traffic lights, storefront signs, neon reflections on wet pavement. It had rained earlier. The road still shimmered like glass. Rhonda Bell sat in the back seat, her body angled slightly toward the window, eyes unfocused but open. She wasn't really watching the city. She was watching something behind it, something inside. The driver didn't speak. He seemed to sense she didn't want conversation. Only the radio whispered, a low jazz instrumental that filled the car like breath, smooth and unobtrusive. Her phone rested on the seat beside her, face down. She had turned off notifications. She wasn't ready for the flood of messages she knew would come, from coworkers, her supervisor, maybe even hospital board members who'd read about the incident before hearing it from her. She could already imagine the awkward sympathy, the sudden concern. Why didn't you say anything sooner? She had said things before. They just hadn't listened, but this time